Chapter 9. Walkabout languished at Hearthstone, in a prison far more forbidding than the one that had secured Morgan Lee. He had returned from Storlock, filled with a fiery determination to cure the sickness that attacked him, to drive from his body the poison that the Asphinx had injected into it, and to heal himself as even the stores could not. Within a week, he had changed completely, grown dispirited and bitter, frightened that his hopes had been in vain, that he could not save himself after all. His days were long, heat-filled stretches of time in which he wandered the valley, lost in thought, desperately trying to reason out what form of magic it would take to stem the poison's flow. His nights were empty and brooding, the dark hours expended in a silent, futile effort to implement his ideas. Nothing worked. He tried a little of everything. He began with a series of mindsets and more delvings of his own magic that were designed to dissolve, break apart, turn back, or at least slow the poison's advance. None of these occurred. He used channeling of the magic in the form of an assault, the equivalent of an inner summoning of the fire that he sometimes used to protect and defend. The channeling could not seem to find a ready source. It scattered and lost its potency. He attempted spells and conjurings from the lore he had accumulated over the years, both that which was innate and that he had been taught. All failed. He resorted finally to the chemicals and powders that Cogline relied upon, the sciences of the old world brought into the new. He attacked the stone ruin of his arm and tried to burn it to the flesh so that cauterization might take place. He tried healing potions that were absorbed through the skin and permeated the stone. He used magnetic and electric fields. He used antitoxins. These too failed. The poison was too strong. It could not be overcome. It continued to work its way through his system, slowly killing him. Rumour stayed at his side almost constantly, trailing silently after him on his long daytime walks, stretching out next to him in the darkness of his room, as he struggled in vain to employ the magic in a way that would allow him to survive. The giant moorcat seemed to sense what was happening to Walker. It watched him as if fearful he might disappear at any moment, as if by watching closely it might somehow protect against the unseen thing that threatened. The luminous yellow eyes were always there, regarding him with intelligence and concern, and Walker found himself staring into them hopefully, searching for the answers he could find nowhere else. Cogline, too, did what he could to help Walker in his struggle. Like the moorcat, he kept watch, albeit at somewhat greater distance, afraid that Walker would not tolerate it if he came too close or stayed too long. There was still an antagonism between the two that would not be dispelled. It was difficult for them to remain in each other's presence for more than a few minutes at a time. Cogline offered what advice he could, mixing powders and potions at Walker's request, administering salves and healing medicines, suggesting forms of magic he thought might help. Mostly, he provided what little reassurance he could that an antidote would be found. Walker, though he would not admit it to the other, was grateful for that reassurance. For the first time in many years, he did not want to be alone. He had never given much thought to his own death, always convinced it was still far away, and he would be prepared for it in any case when it arrived. He discovered now that he had been wrong on both counts. He was angry and frightened and confused. His emotions careened about inside him like stones tossed in a wagon bed, the debris of some emptied load. He fought to maintain a sense of balance, a belief in himself, some small measure of hope, but without the steadying presence of Cogline, he would have been lost. The old man's face and voice, his movements, his idiosyncrasies, all so familiar, were held handholds on the cliff to which Walkabow clung, and they kept him from dropping away completely. He had known Cogline a long time, in the absence of Pa and Cole, and to a lesser extent, Wren. Cogline was his only link with the past, a past that he had in turn scorned, reviled, and finally cast away entirely, a past he was now desperate to regain, as it was his link to the use of the magic that could save him. Had he not been so quick to disparage it, so anxious to be rid of its influence, he had taken more time to understand it, to learn from it, to master it and make it serve his needs, he might not be struggling so hard now to stay alive. But the past is always irretrievable, and so Walker both found it here. Yet there was some comfort to be taken from the continued presence of the old man, who had given him what understanding of the magic he had. With his future become so shockingly uncertain, he discovered a strange and compelling need to reach out to those things that remained his from the past. The most immediate of those was Cogline. Cogline had come to him during the second year of his solitary life at Hearthstone. Reese had been dead 15 years, Kenneth 5. He had been on his way ever since, despite the efforts of Yarraland and Mariana Olmsford to make him a part of their family, an outcast from everyone because his magic would not let him be otherwise. While it had disappeared with the coming of age of all the Olmsford since Bryn, it did not do so in him. Rather, it grew stronger, more insistent, more uncontrollable. It was bad enough when he lived in Shady Vale. It became intolerable at Hearthstone. It began to manifest itself in new ways, unwanted perceptions, strange foresights, harsh sensory recognition, and frightening exhibitions of raw power that threatened to shatter him. He could not seem to master them. He didn't understand them to begin with, and therefore could not find a way to decipher their workings. It was best that he was alone. No one would have been safe around him. He found his sanity slipping away. Cogline changed everything. He came out of the trees one afternoon, materializing from the mist that spilled down off the Wolf's Gate at Autumn's close. A little old man with robes that hung precariously on his stick frame, wild, unkempt hair, and sharp, knowing eyes. Rumour was with him, a massive, immutable black presence that seemed to foreshadow the change that was to come into the Dark Uncle's life. Cogline related to Walker the history of his life from the days of Bremen and the Druid Council to the present. 1,000 years of time. It was a straightforward telling that did not beg for acceptance, but demanded it. Strangely enough, Walker complied. He sensed that this wild and improbable tale was the truth. He knew the stories of Cogline from the time of Bryn Omsford, and this old man was exactly who and what the stories had described. I was the sleeping Druid. I was in the Druid sleep, Cogline explained at one point. Well, I would have come sooner. I had not thought it was time yet, but the magic that resides within you, brought to life with your arrival at manhood, tells me that it is. Eleanor planned it so that when he gave the blood trust to Bryn, there would come a time when the magic would be needed again, and one among the Umsford would be required to wield it. I think that perhaps you are meant to be that one, Walker. If so, you will need my help in understanding how the magic works. Walker was filled with misgivings. recognized that the old man might be able to show him how to bring the magic under control. He needed that control desperately. He was willing to take a chance that Cogline could give it to him. Cogline stayed with him for the better part of 3 years. He revealed to Walker as a teacher to a student the lore of the Druids, the keys that would unlock the doors of understanding. He taught the ways of Bremen and Alanon, of going within to harness the magic's raw power, of working mindsets so that the power could be channeled and not loosed haphazardly. Walker had some knowledge to begin with. He had lived with the magic for many years and learned something of the self-denial and restraint that was necessary to survive its demands. Cogline expanded on that knowledge, advancing it into areas that Walker had not thought to go, instructing on methods he had not believed possible. Slowly, gradually, Walker began to find that the magic no longer governed his life. Unpredictability gave way to self-control. Walker began to master himself. Cogline instructed on the sciences of the old world as well, the chemicals and potions that he had developed and utilized over the years, the powders that burned through metal and exploded like fire, and the solution that changed the form of both liquids and solids. Another set of doors opened for Walker. He discovered an entirely different form of power. His curiosity was such that he began to explore a combining of the two, old world and new world, a blending of magic and science that no one had ever successfully tried. He proceeded slowly, cautiously, determined that he would not become another of the victims that the power had claimed over the years. From the men of the old world who had brought about the great wars to rebel, Druid Brona, his skull bearers, and the Maud race who had sparked the wars of the races. Then for some reason his thinking changed. Perhaps it was the exhilaration he felt when wielding the magic. Perhaps it was the insatiable need to know more. Whatever it was, he came to believe that complete mastery over the magic was not possible. That no matter how diligently he went about protecting himself against its adverse effects, the power would eventually claim him. His attitude toward using it reversed itself overnight. He tried to back away from it, to thrust it from him. His dilemma was enormous. He sought to distance himself from the magic, yet he could not do so successfully because it was an integral part of him. Cogline saw what was happening and tried to reason with him. Walker refused to listen, wondering all of a sudden why it was that Cogline had come to him in the first place. No longer believing it was simply to help, an effort was being made to manipulate him. A druidic conspiracy that could be traced all the way back to the time of Shay Omsford. He would not be a part of it. He quarrelled with Cogline, then fought. In the end, Cogline went away. He came back, of course, over the years, but Walker would no longer accept instructions on the use of the magic, fearing that further knowledge would result in an erosion of the control. He had worked so hard to gain that enhancement would lead to usurpation. Better simply to rely on what understanding he had, limited but manageable, and keep apart from the races as he had planned from the first. Cogline could come and go. They could maintain their uneasy alliance, but he would not give himself over to the ways of Druids, or once Druids, or anyone else. He would be his own person until the end. And now, they had come. He was no longer so sure of the path he had chosen to take. Death had arrived to claim him, and had he not distanced himself so from the magic, he might have delayed its arrival a bit longer. Admission of the possibilities required swallowing a bitter dose of pride. It was harsh to second-guess himself so, but it could not be avoided. Walkabout had never in his life shied away from the truth. He refused to begin doing so now. On the second week of his return from Storlock, sitting before the fire in the early evening hour, the pain of his sickness, a constant reminder of things left undone, he said to Cogline, who was somewhere in the shadows behind, rummaging through the books he kept at the cottage for his own use, "Come sit with me, old man." He said it kindly, wearily, and Cogline came, without argument, seating himself at Walker's elbow. Together they stared into the fire's bright glow. "I am dying," Walker said after a time. "I have tried everything to dispel the poison, and nothing has worked. Even my magic has failed, and your science. We have to accept what that means. I intend to keep working to prevent it, but it seems that I will not survive." He shifted his arm uncomfortably against his side, a stone weight that worked relentlessly to pull him down, to make an end of him. "There are things I need to say to you before I die." Cogline turned toward him and started to speak, but Walker shook his head. "I have embittered myself against you without reasonable cause. I have been unkind to you when you have been more than kind to me. I am sorry for that." He looked at the old man. "I was afraid of what the magic would do to me if I continued to give myself over to it. I am still afraid. I have not changed my thinking completely. I still believe that the Druids use the Omsford for their own purposes, that they tell us what they wish and direct us as they choose. It is a hard thing for me to accept that I should be made their cat's paw, but I was wrong to judge you, one of them. Your purpose has not been theirs. It has been your own." "As much as any purpose in mind, and not only of circumstance and fate," Cogline said, and his face was sad. "We use so many words to describe what happens to us, and it all amounts to the same thing. We live out our lives as we are meant to live, with some choice, with some chance, but mostly as a result of the persons we are." He shook his head. "Who is to say that I am any freer of the Druids than their manipulations than you, Walker? Alanon came to me in the same way as he did to you, young Pa and Ren, and made me this. I cannot claim otherwise." Walker nodded. "Nevertheless, I have been harsh with you, and I wish I had not been. I wanted you to be the enemy because you were a flesh and blood person, not a druid, dead and gone, or an unseen magic, and I could strike out at you. I wanted you to be the source of the fear I felt. It made things easy for me if I thought of you that way." Cogline shrugged. "Do not apologize. The magic is difficult burden for any to bear, but more so for you." He paused. "I don't believe you will ever be free of it." "Except in death," Walker said. "If death comes as swiftly as you think it will." The old man's eyes blinked. "Would Alanon establish a trust that he could be thwarted so easily? Would he risk the complete undoing of his work on the chance that you might die too soon? Walker hesitated. Even Druids can be wrong in their judgments. And this judgment? Perhaps the timing was wrong. Another beside myself was meant to possess the magic beyond youth. I am the mistaken recipient. Godline, what can possibly save me now? What is there left to try? The old man shook his head. I do not know, Walker, but I sense that there is something. They were silent then. Rumour stretched out comfortably before the fire, lifted his head to check on Walker, and on there it dropped again. The wood in the fireplace snapped loudly, and a whiff of smoke tinged the air of the room. So you think the Druids are not finished with me yet? Walker said finally. You think they will not let me give up my life? Cogline did not reply at once. Then he said, I think you will determine what is to become of you, Walker. I have always thought that. What you lack is the ability to recognize what you are meant to do, or at least an acceptance of it. Walker felt a chill run through him. The old man's echoed Elanon's. He knew what they meant. That he was to acknowledge that Bryn Omsford's trust was meant for him. That he was to don the magic's armour and go forth into battle, like some invincible warrior brought forth out of time. That he was to destroy the Shadowing. A dying man. How? The silence returned, and this time he did not break it. 3 days later, Walker's condition took a turn for the worse. The medicines of the stores and the ministerings of Cogline suddenly gave way before the onslaught of the poison. Walker woke feverish and sick, barely able to rise. He ate breakfast, walked out onto the porch to enjoy the warmth of the sun, and collapsed. He remembered only snatches of what happened for several days after that. Cogline put him back to bed and bathed him with cold cloths while the poison's fever raged within him in an unquenchable fire. He drank liquids but could not eat. He dreamed constantly. An endless mirage of vile, frightening creatures paraded themselves before him, threatening him as he stood helpless, stripping him of his insanity. He fought back against them as best he could, but he lacked the necessary weapons. Whatever he brought to bear, the monsters withstood. In the end, he simply gave himself over to them and drifted in black sleep. From time to time he came awake, and when he did so, Cogline was always there. It was the old man's reassuring presence that saved him once again, a lifeline to which he clung, pulling him back from the oblivion into which he might otherwise have been swept. The gnarled hands reached out to him, sometimes gripping as if to hold him fast, sometimes stroking as if he were a child in need of comfort. The familiar voice soothed him, speaking words without meaning but filled with warmth. He could feel the others beside him, always near, waiting for him to wake. You are not meant to die, Walkabout, he thought he heard more than once, thought he could not be certain. Sometimes he saw the old man's face bending close, leathery skin wrinkled and seamed, wispy hair and beard grey and dishevelled, eyes bright and filled with understanding. He could smell the other, a forest tree with ancient limbs and trunk, but leaves as fresh and new as spring. When the sickness threatened to overwhelm him, Cogline was there to lift him free. It was because of the old man that he did not give up, that he fought back against the effects of the poison and willed himself to recover. On the 4th day he awoke at midday and took some soup. The poison had been arrested temporarily. the medicines and ministries, and Walker's own will to survive, taking command once more. Walker forced himself to explore the devastation of his shattered arm. The poison had progressed. His arm was turned to stone almost to the shoulder. He wept that night in rage and frustration before he fell asleep. He was aware of Cogline standing over him, a fragile presence against the vast, inexorable dark, telling him quietly that all would be well. He awoke again in the slow, aimless hours between midnight and dawn, when time seems to have lost its way. It was instinct that woke him, a sense that something was impossibly wrong. He struggled up on one elbow, weak and disorientated, unable to pinpoint the source of his trepidation. An odd, unidentifiable sound rose out of the night stillness, a buzz of activity from somewhere without that sleep and sickness rendered indistinct. His breathing was ragged as he pushed himself into a sitting position, shivering beneath his bedclothes against the chill of the air. Light flared sharply, suddenly visible through the breaks in his curtained window. He heard voices. No, he thought anxiously, not voices, guttural, inhuman sounds. It took what strength he had to crawl from the bedside to the window, working his way slowly and painfully through fatigue and fever. He kept still, aware of a need for caution, sensing that he should not reveal himself. Without, the sounds had risen, and an overpowering smell of decay had descended over everything. Groping, he found the window sill before him and pulled himself level with its edge. What he saw through the part in the curtains turned his stomach to ice. Cogline awoke when Rumour nudged him with his face, a rough, urgent shove that brought the old man upright instantly. He had not gone to bed until well after midnight, buried in his books of old world science, fighting to discover some means by which Walkerbo's life could be saved. Eventually, he had fallen asleep in his chair before the fire, the book he was perusing still open in his lap, and it was there that Rumour found him. "Ah, confound it, cut," he muttered. His first thought was that something had happened to Walker. Then he heard the sounds, faint still, but growing louder, growls and snarls and hisses, animal sounds, and no effort being made to disguise their coming. He pushed himself to his feet, taking a moment to wipe the sleep from his eyes. A single lamp burned at the dining table. The fire in the hearth had gone out. Cogline drew his robes close and shuffled toward the front door. Uneasy, anxious to discover what was happening, Rumour went with him, moving ahead. The fur along the ridge of his back bristled, and his muzzle was drawn back to expose his teeth. Whatever was out there, the moorcat didn't like it. Cogline opened the door and stepped onto the covered porch that fronted the cottage. The sky was clear and depthless. Moonlight flooded down through the trees, bathing the valley in white luminescence. The air was cool and brought Cogline fully awake. He stopped at the edge of the porch and stared. Dozens of pairs of tiny red lights blinked at him from out of the shadows of the forest, a vast scattering of delicate scarlet blossoms that shone in the black. They were everywhere, it seemed, ringing the cottage and its clearing. Cogline squinted the better to make them out. Then he realized that they were eyes. He jumped as something moved amid the eyes. It was a man dressed in a black uniform with a silver insignia of a wolf's head sewn on his breast. Cogline saw him clearly as he stepped into the moonlight, big and raw-boned, with a face that was hollow and pitted, and eyes that were empty of life. Rimmer Doll, he thought at once, and experienced a terrible sinking feeling. "Old man," the other said, and his voice was a grating whisper. Cogline did not respond, staring fixedly at the other, forcing himself to keep from looking to his right, to where the window to Walker's bedroom stood open, to where Walker slept. Fear and anger raced through him, and a voice within screamed at him to run, to flee for his life. Quickly, it warned. Wake Walker, help him escape. But he knew that it was already too late for that. He had known for some time now that it would be. We are here for you, old man, whispered Rimadol. My friends and I. He motioned, and the creatures with him began to edge into the light, one after another, horrors all shadowing. Some were misshapen creatures like the woodswoman he had chased from the camp of Par and Colomspid weeks ago. Some had the look of dogs or wolves, bent down on all fours, covered with hair, their faces twisted into animal muzzles, teeth and claws showing. The sounds they made suggested that they were anxious to feed. Failures, their leader said. Men who could not rise above their weaknesses. They serve a better purpose now. He came forward a step. You are the last, old man, the last who stands against me. All the Shannara children are gone, swept from the earth. You are all that remains. A poor once Druid, with no one to save him. The lines that edged Cogline's face deepened. Is that so? He said. Kill them all, did you? Rimadol stared at him. Not half a chance of it. Cogline decided instantly. The truth is, he hasn't killed anyone. Just wants me to think he has. And you came all this way to tell me about it, did you? He said. I came to put an end to you, Rimadol replied. Well, there you have it, the old man thought. Whatever the first seeker had managed to do about the Shannara children, it wasn't enough. So now he had come after Cogline as well. Easier prey, perhaps. The old man almost smiled. To think it had all come down to this. Well, it wasn't as if he hadn't known. Eleanor had warned him weeks ago, warned him in fact when he'd summoned him to retrieve the Druid history from Paranor. So he hadn't told Walker, of course. He had thought about it, but hadn't done it. There just didn't seem to be any point. Know this, Cogline, the shade had intoned. Deep voice, prophetic. I have read the netherworld signs. Your time in this world is nearly finished. Death stalks you. As she is an implacable huntress. When next you see the face of Rimadal, she will have found you. Remember then, when that time comes, take back the Druid history from Walker Bow and hold it to you as if it were your life. Do not release it. Do not give it up. Remember, Cogline. Remember. Cogline collected his thoughts. The Druid history rested within a niche in the stone fireplace inside the cottage, right where Walker had hidden it. Remember. He sighed wearily, resignedly. He had asked questions, of course, but the shade had given no answers. Very like Eleanor. It was enough that Cogline knew what was coming, it seemed. It wasn't necessary that he know the particulars. Rumour snarled, his fur standing on end all over. He was crouched protectively before the old man, and Cogline knew there was no way to save the big cat. Rumour would never leave him. He shook his head. Well, an odd sense of calm settled over him. His thoughts were quite clear. The Shadowin had come for him. They knew nothing at all about Walkabout being there. That was the way he intended to keep it. His brow furrowed. Would the Druid history, if he could reach it, aid him in this? His eyes found Rimadol's. This time he did smile. "I don't think there's enough of you to do the job," he said. His arm swept up and silver dust flew with the first seeker bursting into flames as it struck him. Rimadol screamed in fury and staggered away, and the creatures with him attacked. They came at Cogline from everywhere, but Rumour met them with a lunge, stopped them short of the porch, and tore the foremost to pieces. Cogline flung handfuls of the silver dust at his would-be destroyers, and whole lines of them were set ablaze. The Shadowmen screeched and howled, blundering into one another as they sought first to attack, then to escape. Bodies lurched wildly through the moonlight, filling the clearing with burning limbs. They began attacking each other. They died by the dozens. Easy prey, do they think? Cogline experienced a wild, perverse elation as he flung back his robes and sent the night exploding into white brilliance. For an impossible moment, he thought he might actually survive. But then Rimadol reappeared, too powerful to be overcome by Cogline's small magic, and lashed out with fire of his own at the creatures he commanded, at his dogs and wolves, and half-humans, at his near-mindless brutes. The Shadowing kind, terrified of him, attacked in a renewed frenzy of hate and anger. This time, they would not be driven off. Rumour savaged the first wave, quick and huge amid their smaller forms, and then they were all over him, a maelstrom of teeth and claws. Cogline could do nothing to help the gallant cat. Even the silver dust exploding through them, the Shadowing came on. Rumour slowly began to give ground. Despairing, Cogline used the last of his powder, dashing handfuls to the earth, igniting a wall of flame that for just an instant brought a halt to the beast's advance. Swiftly he darted and snatched the Druid history from its hiding place. Now we'll see. He barely made the front door again before the Shadowed kind were through the wall of fire and on him. He heard Rimadol screaming at them. He felt Rumour press back against him protectively. There was nowhere to run, and no point in trying, so he simply stood his ground, clutching the book to his chest, the scarecrow in tattered robes before a whirlwind. His attackers came on when they had their hands on him as his body was about to be ripped apart. He felt the rune markings on the book flare to life. Brilliant white fire burst forth, and everything within 50 feet was consumed. It remains now for you, Walker, was Cogline's last thought. He disappeared in the flames. The final explosion threw Walker clear of the curtained window. An instant before it was engulfed in flames. Even so, his face and hair were singed and his clothes were left steaming. He lay in a heap as the fire licked its way across the ceiling of his room. He ignored it, no longer caring what happened. He had been helpless to aid Cogline and Rumour, too weak to summon the magic, too weak even to rise and stand with them against the shadow, too weak to do anything but hang there on the window ledge and watch. Useless, he screamed the words silently in his mind, rage and grief washing through him. He lurched to his knees in desperation and peered out through the flames. Cogline and Rumour were gone. Rimadol and what remained of the Shadowing kind were melting back into the forest. He stared after them momentarily, and then his strength left him, and he collapsed again. Useless. The fire's heat intensified about him. Timbers crashed down, fiery brands splintering off and searing his skin. His body jerked in pain, his stone arm an anchor that dragged against the wooden floor. His fate was assured, he realized. Another minute or two, and he would be consumed. No one would come for him. No one even knew he was there. The old man and the giant moorcat had concealed his presence from the Shadowing. They had given up their lives to do so. He shuddered as an image of Rimadol's face appeared in his mind, the dead eyes looking at him appraisingly. He decided he did not want to die. Almost without realizing what he was doing, he began to crawl.